Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberanía!
You know what? It would have been good if the confetti was in the colors, or the colors we chose for the theme of the show.
That's official Soberanía confetti, Jose Luis. You can get it in our merch store, and then you can have hours of fun at home.
Oh, good. For those who may not realize, he's joking, but we do have memberships. Join the channel, support our work. I'm really grateful to everybody who's already joined the St. Patrick's Battalion. The difference is noticeable. We do appreciate it. It's helping us kind of organize ourselves and continue to be able to be these independent journalists and not have to respond to anybody, really, and keep this show going. So we're really grateful for that. And for the rest of you, of course, not everybody's available to like and subscribe as usual. We got a lot on today's show.
And of course, that money helps go to the confetti budget. So, it's helping in a variety of ways.
All right, let me share with you the rundown for this week's episode. Apologies, last week I didn't get a chance to it. We were busy. We're busy people, but this time we do. So we're going to talk about Sheinbaum at the G20. She was a rock star. Mm-hmm. Everybody wanted to meet with Claudia. What a difference for Mexico on the international stage, actually occupying a place of prestige for the rest of the world. And so I'm really glad to have seen that. We got a lot to say about that. It was a big meeting. Lots of things discussed. Of course, we want to talk about the Mexican proposals at the table as well. Sheinbaum delivered her first budget. In fact, the reason we had that shorter term last time around, López Obrador only served 5 years, 10 months, was precisely for this, so that there'd be a little bit of a smoother transition between the old administration and the new administration, so that they can have their budget in the way that they want it. So we're about to break down when it comes to the budget and the PAN, as usual, doing silly things worth making fun of. So we'll get to that. We'll leave that kind of vague for you now. Good news from Mexico. We're going to be talking about women's issues here and losers and haters, which we can't miss. All right. So the first story is Claudia Sheinbaum at the G20. So this is Sheinbaum's first international trip. This is her kind of debut on the world stage. And I think she did a really good job. She did quite an impression on world leaders. And of course, delivering a very important message in terms of a different way of conceiving the way that we spend public finances. Really, this was the headline. This is the one that made the most headlines throughout the world, where she basically made the argument, we need to sow life, not war, proposing that the governments that are assembled here at the group of 20 countries, the Rio Summit, destined just 1% of what they destined for military spending towards a global Sembrando Vida program. So as we know, Sembrando Vida is the social program implemented by López Obrador, which basically is an incentive for communities to for people to stay inside of their communities, plant trees that are either can be used for as a sustainable resource for wood or actually fruits and agriculture as well. So it's something that's been very successful. I think in particular in the context of the abandonment of the countryside in Mexico in the shadow of the free trade agreement, of actually incentivizing, spending the money so that they can actually stay in their communities and have a successful life there. There's been an effort to expand this into Central America, and there's a handful of programs that have begun in Central America, but this is Claudia saying, this is our social program. It's worked well for us. We know that there's interest in this. Not only can this help rural producers, but can also actually help mitigate climate change. And in fact, Claudia was mentioned as one of Time's 100 activists or people who are taking action on the environment. So that was the big headline of Claudia. And of course, she met with a lot of people at this summit. We're going to get into that in a second here. We'll come back to that. But I did want to talk about this. And of course, Kurt, I want to know what you think. What were your general impressions of Claudia at the G20, Mexico's first female president making herself known on the global stage?
And one of the only women there at the G20 in general, right? Very much a men's club at the G20, right? So a few points which I think are very important to point out. This was very much Sheinbaum's swords to plowshares moment. And that's so important in the context of what's happening right now. We're at the doorstep of World War III. I mean, that's not the subject of this podcast, but I mean, that's, extremely worrying what's going on right now in Europe and Ukraine. And, what Sheinbaum did was to point out very specifically how much world armament spending has gone up just in the last few years in a very pointed way. And in a very pointed context, in the context of the fact that she had on one side Justin Trudeau, on the other side Emmanuel Macron, and behind her Butcher Blinken, right? All three of which are complicit in the genocide in Gaza, right? So she didn't say Gaza in so many words, but it was very pointedly a reference to where the world is going with regards to escalating, conflicts, pushed by the West. And the proposal was very simple. 1%, just 1% of arms spending should go to this international version of Sowing Life. So that's one point that I think is very important. The second point to point out is I think this proposal by Sheinbaum had more weight because Mexico has already instituted this program and shown that it can work over the last 6 years. She wasn't just pulling a program out of her hat, out of the abstract. This is a program that I've seen in operation in southern Oaxaca. It's a program that brings communities together. They set up a seed and a plant and tree nurseries. They work together, right? They set up committees. So they also, they plant trees for wood and for fruits in a more practical sense, but they also plant trees, for example, in public spaces and for beautification and for a lot of means. But it's these local committees that decide how and where the trees are done, and they set it up through this nursery program, which I find really interesting. So the program has been shown to work. It's been in place for 6 years, and it already has an international component because Mexico is paying for sowing, for the program to be applied in Central America, right? In Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So Mexico's first shown it can be done, and also shown that there can be international cooperation on this, which is extremely important. And of course, Sheinbaum's credentials as a climate change engineer come with that, right? Third point I think to make on this before we move ahead is that people have been wondering what's going to be the difference, what's going to be the Sheinbaum accent on the fourth transformation, or how is the second PISO going to look? I think this is an example of something different. I find it difficult to think that AMLO would have attended the G20. He might have, but that wasn't his scene. His scene was very much his love for Mexico and the idea that the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy, right? What we see here is Sheinbaum just barely a month into office, going to the G20 and doing very well. Very naturally meeting with both Biden and Xi Jinping, Trudeau and Macron, but also the leaders of South Korea and Japan, right? So she was playing the scene. And Mexico was specifically invited by Brazil because Lula wanted Mexico there and got a very warm welcome by Lula, to contrast very much with the very cold welcome, for example, given to Milei, right? So this is, I think, to be pointed out, this is a difference in accent. Not, Sheinbaum is very much in the line of the foreign policy of López Obrador, but it's now taking what Mexico has done and bringing it to world stage and saying Mexico can, as the world's 12th largest economy, can be a player in this, and was recognized as such by other countries.
I think in particular, the opportunity, like you said, to share the successes of the Mexican story, especially right now, that people are asking these questions, like what's happening in Mexico? Who is Claudia Sheinbaum? A lot of people are not familiar with her. Who is this Mexican Jewish woman with, a last name that's not very typical of Hispano-parlante countries, right? I wanted to take a pause here and talk about the fact that she had a bilateral meeting with Trudeau, which I think was necessary. I think one of the privileges of attending these is precisely the ability to have these face-to-face conversations.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of weeks, we've heard provincial premiers speak about the need to leave out Mexico from the negotiations or the revisiting the review of the free trade agreement between the three North American countries. We saw Danielle Smith of Alberta and Doug Ford of Ontario. a note on that. I'm very familiar with Canadian politics. I lived many years in that country. These are provincial premiers. They don't have any say on foreign policy. They're actually conservative premiers, so they're in opposition to the federal Liberal Party. So their comments are giving a lot of weight that they really shouldn't be. It's like, if the governor of, Guanajuato started talking about the situation at the federal level. It's not really their place. So as we've seen is this amplification of the criticism from these conservative premiers on the international stage. But of course, one thing to remember, and I've seen a lot of people mention this, and I want to emphasize it here on our program, which is that people should remember that Canada was almost kicked out of the free trade agreement negotiations.
But for Mexico.
But for Mexico. It was Lopez Obrador who insisted to Donald Trump, hey, we need to have a tripartite agreement here. I know that you don't get along with the federal Liberals in particular. He seemed to really dislike Trudeau and Freeland personally. And if it wasn't for Mexico's advocacy, Canada might have been left out. So it's unfortunate they don't remember that. But I imagine that in this meeting that was brought up, that this needs to be a 3-country agreement always, and that they shouldn't entertain these notions. And I hope we hear less from these people. Doug Ford has always kind of paraded around as if he's a champion of the working class. He is a very to-the-bone conservative, very, very dislikable figure, in my opinion, when it comes to Canadian politics. Same with Danielle Smith, who actually comes from the far right in Alberta. These people don't actually have much influence. But of course, Trudeau is also, worried about the election, so he hasn't been so quick to shut down those kinds of comments. Nonetheless, we see the diplomacy of the Mexican government right here on the screen, which is that, yeah, okay, you haven't been a good friend to us, but we have an important relationship, so we'll make sure that you have the time. But of course, who else was at the meeting? Who was that? Kurt Hackbarth.
It was the Chinese premier, Xi Jinping.
That's right. Xi Jinping. And they shared a lengthy readout of their meeting. We'll give a quick summary here. Xi Jinping congratulated on her election. They talked about their long history of friendship. They should continue to have these exchanges and renewing their friendships. And I think this part was really kind of interesting when they say they take advantage of the high complementarity of the two economies and advance towards a practical cooperation to promote integral development and bilateral relationships. So as we know that there is this effort, especially in the circles in Washington and in Ottawa, to try to isolate Mexico or get to Mexico to take a side, quote unquote, and act against China the way that the US and Canada have done. We have to remember, right, to the degree this got to, they arrested a key figure from Huawei. Canada acted as a deputy of the United States foreign policy and arresting somebody in that case. So things have been pretty rough for those countries, but Mexico has a positive relationship with China. It always has been. And there's no need for Mexico to necessarily have to take a side and join in this effort to try to reduce the influence of China on the global stage, which continues to grow, as we see here. Of course, not too long ago, there was also the BRICS conference with them playing an important role there.
Yeah, so, this tweet is interesting for the reasons you mentioned, and I'd also like to highlight that last paragraph where it says China and Mexico share similar viewpoints and ideas on many international matters. Wink, wink, right? Share viewpoints and similar ideas in many international matters, and both push for economic globalization that is universally beneficious, right, or rewarding and inclusive. China is willing to work with Mexico to defend multilateralism. That's the key word. And equity in international justice, and to inject positive energy and development in the world economy. Now, this comes just days after China came out with a very stiff communique with regards to the United States, in which Xi Jinping laid out, as clearly as China has ever done, 4 red lines that it is no longer willing to tolerate, from the West, with regards to, for example, their hypocritical posturing on China's human rights record, as Keir Starmer did yesterday in the G20. Right. Of course, the Taiwan issue and others, but it was a very stringent communique from China, which shows that it's less willing to brook any shit, and it's more of an indicator of its strengthened, increased confidence on the world stage, of course, backed, of course, by its becoming an economic powerhouse. And you see some of this rather frank language here, right? It says we share international points of view with Mexico, and we're willing to work with Mexico to create a multilateral system. Well, what does that mean? That can only mean one thing. If Trump and Rubio et al. Come down too hard on Mexico, we're going to be there to open the door to BRICS or other forms of communication. So watch it. The old world is over, and we are here. Hello.
I love that message. Now, before we move on, I also wanted to highlight this, which got much, much less attention, which is actually during her second intervention at the gathering of the G20. She actually brought up this Mexican proposal that was floated previously under López Obrador to reform the Security Council of the United Nations. As we know, the Security Council has 5 permanent members, and those 5 permanent members have a veto. So if they vote against a resolution from the Security Council, which is the most important body, even more important, arguably, than the General Assembly at the United Nations, which is in charge with preserving peace in the world, well, they can vote against it, and it doesn't go forward. And that's exactly what we've seen with the ongoing genocide in Palestine.
Yeah.
There have been countless resolutions that have been brought forward, and the U.S. has blocked them. The bloody hand of the United States stopping the end of this aggression because they favor their ally, their outpost, the genocidal Zionist entity there. So, of course, this is really important. I mean, the UN was founded in the shadow of the Second World War precisely to prevent genocides from happening in a lot of ways. That was one of the major motivations. The Security Council exists precisely to try to stop conflicts from escalating, and it has totally failed. If there's ever a moment,
utterly failed. Yeah.
If there was ever a moment, now is the time for this change to happen. Let's reform the Security Council because it's clearly not working. And I love that it's Mexico bringing this proposal back to the table. It's not the first time, but saying, once again, this is really important. Now, of course, it's got less attention. And I love what you said at the beginning, right? With Anthony Blinken right behind her, the butcher, Blinken. And so it's important to say that it's a woman sitting at the front of the table and bringing forward these proposals. And I think it's what's also important. I really like this tweet here, which is that, who is Mexico now? It's a player on the international stage. It's a player. It demands respect. Part of it is because of what's been achieved inside. López Obrador was often attributed with this quote saying, "Oh, the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy." And in a sense, this is somewhat true, right? Mexico is not a country that is, falling into lawlessness as it was before, which is actually doing what it needs to when it comes to addressing poverty. We see this tweet from here on the screen: 11 million people lifted out of poverty. That gives you an authority, especially because this was being hosted by Lula and Brazil, where one of the themes was tackling hunger, right? And so I think it's really quite encouraging when you see someone like Claudia Sheinbaum with her background, with her mandate, being the one to bring these proposals to the table. And I think it's also a very kind of convincing story, right? So life, not war, especially, again, given that Mexico on the international stage is mostly viewed in the lens of, the conflict between cartels and organized crime groups and all the rest of it, all the Hollywood depiction of Mexico with that sepia tone, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very different kind of view. And I'm glad that this is the one that most of the world is now getting a chance to see, thanks to Claudia Sheinbaum and her participation at the G20.
Yeah, just to round this out, too, what you see on the screen there is Claudia Sheinbaum, a flying coach to Brazil, which, of course, incensed the Mexican right and is very much a continuation of López Obrador's personal austerity and governance. How dare she show up in coach, right? Everybody else went in their own private jets because we're talking about climate change. We're talking about climate change, and all these hypocrites go in their private jets. She flew coach, as AMLO did, right? And I think that your point is well taken. Mexico has authority on these matters because it can bring receipts, because it's shown that it can, implement these programs and that they can work. Okay, exactly. And so you're not going to have as much authority if you haven't done it before.
Not only was it coach, by the way, but with a layover. It wasn't even a direct flight, which is incredible. right? Like had to do a layover in Panama just like everybody else. She
Mhm.
did get the exit row. I did notice they at least gave her the exit row, a little bit more leg room there for the president. But it's incredible. You're right.
And
Especially if
just
you
to
think
point
about
out
Peña
too,
Nieto.
let us not forget that AMLO was the one who hung the moniker on the UN as a florero.
Yeah.
It's just a vase. It's a vase with flowers on the table of international power. Wasn't wrong. Now, I'm sure Scheinbaum wouldn't use the language florero. She's a little bit more diplomatic in that sense. But the whole point of the proposal is that it not be a florero anymore. Right? Doubt that they'll reform the UN, but yes, as you say, I'm glad the proposal is coming from Mexico.
That's right. So, Dr. Oscar Rojas here talking to us about the political economy. This what gives authority, which I think is the perfect segue to our second topic this week, which is her first budget. I wanted to start with you, Kurt. You've had a chance to look at some of the numbers. You're a little bit more studious than I am in that regard. Let us know, what do you think? What are your first impressions of Claudia Sheinbaum's first budget? Like I said at the beginning of the program, the whole point of shifting the inauguration up a couple of months is so that this budget that comes down around this time and will be approved before the end of the year is one that's more in line with the new government and its agenda.
Yeah, so maybe we can put some of the numbers up. We have some interesting graphics to share with you of kind of who are the winners and losers in this first Scheinbaum budget. My general sense of the budget is that what you see is an incoming Scheinbaum government trying to, as left governments in the global south are somewhat forced to do, calm the markets with their first budget. Let us recall that AMLO's first budget was rather an austerity budget as well. And what you see is the effort by this administration, with the holdover finance secretary from the last of the AMLO administration, is to do three things at once, kind of have three balls in the air at once. First ball is she wants to fund her priority programs, which she laid out in the campaign, which is reducing the pension age for women from 65 to 60, the universal scholarship program, which was already in place for higher grades, extending it down to secondary and elementary school, the housing plan, which we talked about, the 1 million of public units, trains, and the food sovereignty program, which we talked about in the last episode. So first ball in the air, fund those priorities. Second ball in the air, reduce the deficit, which did go up somewhat in the last year of AMLO because there was a push to complete many of these big ticket infrastructure projects, such as the Tren Maya. And the third ball in the air is to not raise taxes. She's continued AMLO's reticence in that area. AMLO won election in 2018 on a no new taxes pledge and kept that pledge throughout his administration, to the mortification of some on the left who very legitimately see that the rich have to pay more in taxes in Mexico because they don't pay enough. So you have these three balls in the air, right? Fund priority programs, try to reduce the deficit, and not raise taxes. So that requires shifting some money around. As we see here on the screen, right? If we want to go back to we can talk about what you have on the screen as well. And then I want to go back to some of the winners and losers in a second from that Economist. Here it is. So let's go here. This is some of the losers in quotes of the budget. The left should be happy with number one, right? The international left, which have been so critical about the quote unquote militarization of Mexico, that the defense budget is being reduced 44%, almost half. Imagine in the US if they reduced the Pentagon budget by half, which they'd never do. That would free up $400 billion for everything else. Medicare for all, canceling student debt, canceling medical debts, public housing in the US, right? And as Leonardo Toledo, friend of the program, says here, it's very curious that almost nobody's talking about the cuts to Sedena, the defense budget, right? At the G20, the president proposed barely a 1% cut in military spending for the G20 countries, but Mexico is reducing it by 44%. As some of these big ticket infrastructure projects wrap up as well. So let's go
Before
back.
you move on, though, a point on that, which is interesting. You know, one of the reasons why they're able to cut from the yearly budget the spending for the defense is because they now have other sources of income. The much criticized militarization of society, the fact that the armed forces now run airports and other kind of businesses, duanas, that kind of thing, it actually provides them income. And now they can use that income instead of the public budget. And the public budget, which is a political document, we should always underline that, can express its priorities in a different way. It's funny how we always talk about them here on the program, right? The progres buenonditas, right? Sort of the liberal progressives who fail to include class in their analysis many times often point to this. They're like, oh, this is an austerity budget. Yeah, once again, the so-called left failing the population, right? No, what we're actually looking at is actually a reallocation. Now, there are some things that I think rightfully can be criticized, but let's take a look at the actual numbers before we get into that.
Yeah, let's go back to the economist piece. And just to comment on what you were saying there too, you're absolutely right. I think the danger of that is that the military has its own sources of income. It can feel more independent from the executive control. So that's just something to keep in mind going forward. So other losers in the budget would be the environmental budget. Health is down. That's kind of misleading because the actual health secretary is down, but spending for EAMS is up, right? So the money has been shifted from the actual health secretariat itself into the actual health agencies, EAMS and ISTE, right? Same thing with energy, which sees a big cut in the actual Secretariat of Energy, but you see an increase in for example, the Federal Electricity Commission. So you're seeing kind of a shifting around within these budgets, right? And also some of the autonomous agencies, which are on the chopping block anyway. They have to be funded because they're still part of the federal government, but they're on the chopping block there as well. So that's some of the losers. I don't know if you have any comments on this before we go on, Mr. Luis, because you said there were some kind of red lights there too.
No, I think, for example, like let's look at the social spending. So we have this tweet up here. This is just the social spending. First point I would make to those who say that it's an austerity budget, in the sense that it is an austere budget. The spending on 2025 over 2024 on social is still up. Right? It's a reallocation. We've seen a drop in some places. But look at this. Social housing, 552% increase. This is something we talked about on a previous program. You want to address the housing shortage. You want to address the inaffordability crisis of housing throughout the world, Mexico included. It means the state has to intervene. And the state has to intervene by spending money, by increasing the budget to this tune. This is what we're talking about. This is what it looks like. The kind of thing that people tell you is impossible. Oh, no, what you're proposing is out to field, it's out to lunch. You don't know what you're talking about? Yes, you can. Here's the proof. An increase of 552%. That's an incredible increase because that's what it takes. Same with the scholarships, right? You want to support low-income people being able to actually you got to make sure that they can eat and pay for transport. How do you do that? Scholarships, right? And so that's why we see an increase in scholarships and an expansion into other areas, including secondary school, et cetera, right? So, a couple of the other ones, for example, one of the ones that I saw some people online criticizing is the drop in the one for La Escuela es Nuestra, which is direct cash transfers to the committees of parents at every school so they can improve their schools. I think it kind of makes sense. There's still a long way to go, but that's the kind of thing that you can spend a little bit less each year because you've made an investment already, right? And so it makes sense that it's not necessarily exactly at the top. Now, really, the conversation that I think this leads us to, and we're finally starting to hear it from Morena politicians, is that the Mexican model is basically based around enforcing existing tax laws, right? There actually is a relatively progressive taxation system in Mexico. The problem is that the rich, because of their political connections, never paid, or paid very little, or had it forgiven, or had it pushed down the road. That stopped. But that has limits. There's only so far you can get in terms of increasing the income for the government by doing that. And finally, we're hearing Morena politicians talk about the tax reform.
Yeah, a progressive.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
Now, we couldn't do one until the judicial reform, right? Yeah. So now we can really put it on there. And all of those people out there who are saying, this is what we need, which we need, I agree with you, right? But now the pieces are in place. Also, what we don't need is lectures on social media. What we need is mobilization. We need to put pressure on these politicians so they actually put forward a new progressive tax on the rich in this country.
That can be enforced, right? That's the important thing here. So this kind of goes back to my original point with regards to the budget. It's just one thing to just put on paper, we're going to build public homes, but you have to back it up with funds. And you see that 550% increase for Infonavit, plus the constitutional reform that allows them to directly build public housing without siphoning and losing the money through private contractors. So that's very important as well. The scholarship program and the women's pension age reduction, other things. So that's important there. With regards to tax reform, some people have said, well, Mexico already has a progressive tax system with regards to the income tax bans, which, as you say, is very easily evaded. But there are plenty of other ways you can tax the rich. There are plenty of other ways you can tax the rich. You can tax estates. Mexico doesn't have an estate tax. Tax estates, right? Mexico's stock market capital gains tax is 10%. So tax capital gains like income. That's an easy one, right? They say, oh, well, we don't want to do that because it's we want people to invest in the stock market. Come on, right? Because the stock market is more volatile in Mexico than the place. What you're doing is you're favoring capital over labor every time that you tax labor more than capital. Raise the capital gains tax. How about a Tobin tax on financial transactions? A tiny little tax on international transactions to cut down on speculation and raise funds from people who buy and sell stocks like this and all this stuff. Try to make quick gains instead of investing long term in the Mexican economy. What you want is long term investment, not quick in and out speculation. That's what the Tobin tax is about. So we could do a whole, other show on this, but there are plenty of ways to attack the inequality problem and tax the rich without necessarily raising, although I think there should be, another income tax band at the top, possibly. There's a lot.
Kurt. Let's attack the rich. Attack the rich. We had Paco Taibo II.
Freudian slip, but I'll accept it.
Yeah. We had Paco Taibo II. He's the head of the Fondo de Cultura Económica here, the public firm for publishing in Mexico. He's a hardcore leftist, the child of Spanish exiles from the Republican period. And he was with Sabina Berman. And they asked him, they're like, should we expropriate Ricardo Salinas Pliego? He's like, yes, of course. I agree. Yeah, let's go after this. I mean, if we had an estate tax, he wouldn't be as rich as he is.
That's
absolutely.
That's the clearest one. I mean, just come in Mexico and see the savage inequalities of this country. Yeah. It's enough to turn anyone into a leftist economist. And the estate tax would be fundamental in this, because that's what you have. The juniorism is just passing down ill-begotten estates from one generation to another. That has to end.
Yeah. Now, one final thing before we move on, which is a point of observation. Sometimes people ask us to be critical of the government. We're not propagandists. We are journalists with sympathies. But I do think that there is a risk about going too far with keeping the Republican austerity in mind as they go forward with this budget, which obviously is just the first step. There will be a whole legislative process. There may be some additions, some subtractions. In fact, that we should mention there was an error, a mistake that was made, that they didn't actually assign in the document the right amount of money to the two major public universities here, La UNAM and the Politecnica, and that has been reviewed. They're like, act of contrition. Nope, we made a mistake there, a sincere mistake. And in fact, if you check the math, it's right. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an after the fact fix around the funding there. But anyway, the point I want to make around this is that I think a lot of people have compared, naturally, Claudia Sheinbaum to Dilma Rousseff of Brazil. So you had a very popular leader, leaves office with sky-high approval ratings. In comes in his successor, somebody very close to that. So the parallels are there. But Dilma Rousseff, in her second government, so after winning re-election, an election that was largely a pivot to the center, decides to promote an austerity budget. Now, this was an austerity budget in the sense that it was very much minded at the fact that there was less money coming in for various factors, given the time that it was presented. But it was now generally viewed as a critical mistake, and one of the mistakes that led to her eventual ouster via parliamentary coup. We have to remember, Dilma was undemocratically ousted over budget mechanism that she pursued, and then the Congress, in a total political theater, ousted her from office and put in a right-winger, her vice president, Michel Temer. Now, I think it is correct to look at that experience, understanding the differences, but the fact that Dilma presented an austerity budget when she did led to a lot of the social unrest that eventually snowballed into a situation that lended itself to her undemocratic ouster. There is I think, genuine concern. I have this tweet up here from a Bloomberg reporter who talks about the fact that reinforcing a negative loop on public finances. Now, this is a risk. If you cut too far, you actually decelerate the economy. The budgets depend on economies growing. Now, the U.S. economy is actually pretty resilient right now. We'll see what happens with Trump, but it's continuing to grow and it's continuing to increase its demand for Mexican products. That's good. But if that changes and we have a budget that's a little bit cutting a little bit too close to the bone, you could provoke what he talks about here, which is the negative loop, which is basically you have less income and then you make more cuts. So you make more cuts. So you have less income. It just keeps going. It spirals to a really bad situation. And we know that the cornerstone of the fourth transformation of Mexico, the project started by López Obrador and continued by Claudia Sheinbaum, is social investment. Repairing that social debt of actually investing in the population. We saw in the previously on the program a couple of cuts here and there. Some I think are justifiable, maybe some less. But the point is that people have to feel like their lives are continuing to improve under these governments. Otherwise, as we've been harping, as people have been asking us, what's the difference between what happened in the U.S. and Mexico? Well, you have to continue to invest in the population, in the working class, in the campesinos, in the marginalized, so that they continue to support that political project. That part is indispensable. And if you fall into this loop, you run into the risk of giving your enemies the tools they need to possibly undemocratically take you out of office.
Yeah, and I think, being a little optimistic here, but this is something she said. Claudia Sheinbaum did say in her press conference a few days ago that they would consider a tax reform for the second year. She said, though, I think there's still enough to be gotten without a tax reform by tightening loopholes and such. But she didn't rule it out. And that's the closest we've gotten from a Morena government to saying that they would consider a tax reform. So think about it, guys.
That's what we have to push for, right? None of this finger wagging, not like, Mexico's not left enough for not doing a tax reform. Help us along this way. I think that's important. That's a key thing to see. And I think we can get there. I also think that with Pemex being on firmer footing and the likely increase, given the geopolitical situation in the world right now, of the price of oil will also mean that the budget's going to have a little bit more room to work with. And so we'll see what happens with that. But hopefully that isn't enough to stop them from what we agree with should happen, tax reform.
Yeah.
All right. So our next topic, funeral for the pan. What does this mean, Kurt? Fill us in. Who the pan is dead?
Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse for Mexico's right-wing party, the PAN. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse. We've talked in this show about how outgoing leader Marco Cortés tried to align himself with Trumpism by pushing for the FTO designation to have the cartels in Mexico be labeled as foreign terrorist organizations, which would open the door to even further U.S. Interference in Mexico and third country renditions and God knows what else. Just this blatant Slavish servilismo, being a mat to Trumpism, and showing the Mexican right to be effectively traitors to their country as they have been for a long, long, long time in history, as if that wasn't enough. As if the election of Jorge Romero as the new leader of the PAN weren't enough. Jorge Romero, the corrupt, young, wealthy, fresh face who was up to his neck, or up here, the forehead, in the real estate cartel, which we've discussed abundantly in this program, and just, keeps trying to wash his hands of it and saying, oh, well, they were just people operating on their own. They weren't, we weren't in cahoots there, and they were just operating on their own. They were kind of some bad apples. Right? As if all that weren't bad enough. As if it weren't bad enough that Marco Cortés was off in Spain. As if it weren't bad enough that the PRI is reelected. Total crook, and Alito Moreno is their leader. All that. So then you have the PAN, who decides that it's a good idea on the occasion of the election of the leader to the Human Rights Commission in Mexico to dress in black. Look at the picture. To dress in black and say, oh, we're at the funeral of the Human Rights Commission because we didn't get the person we wanted. Right? There's two readings of this, and neither of them is particularly flattering to the PAN. One of them is the PAN was attending its own funeral as a political party. That's what it looks like. The rump of what's left of the PAN is attending their own funeral, which is actually kind of an interesting metafictional kind of device that you're attending your own funeral, right there. So that's kind of interesting. The other reading is a lot darker, that they're imitating, consciously or not, Mussolini's black shirts from the 20s and 30s. Let us not forget that the PAN was founded in 1939 at the height of Phalangism in Europe. And that was their direct inspiration. That That and to fight against the expropriation of oil, which had happened a year before. So you have a right-wing party in Mexico, which tries to present itself as a reasonable, mainstream right-wing party, right? They've been flip-flopping on whether they supported the social programs, and they didn't. Donning black shirts and deciding that it's a great idea to have a photo up and put this up on social media. And as many people pointed out when I posted this on my own Twitter account, it's unclear whether they even know who Mussolini was or who the black shirts were. Was it conscious, or are they really that dumb? They might be that dumb, Jose Luis. They might be that ignorant of history. They might just be. I think their knowledge of history goes back maybe as far as Felipe Calderon. So whichever way you interpret it, the PAN's funeral, a conscious black shirt imitation, or just dumb historical ignorance, it doesn't reflect well on a party that's already doing very badly.
One final reading on this, the one that jumped out at me, is that this is kind of insensitive, right? The Human Rights Commission was created to basically shine a light on human rights abuses that happen in Mexico, historically into the present, and to treat it flippantly as if, which obviously involves a lot of cases of extrajudicial killings, for example, to make a joke of it, right? To say, oh, the wrong person was chosen to lead it, whatever criticisms you can have of the process, right? To do this theater when we're talking about an agency, an institution that is meant to protect human rights is actually pretty offensive. So whatever reading you want to give it, I don't even know who they're trying to appeal to by doing these kinds of actions. And not to mention, look who's in the picture. Who's at his right? Jorge Triana, which represents some of the most retrograde, backwards thinking of the PAN. And then I think that's Ricardo Anaya in the background.
In the back. Yeah, he's in the back.
He's there. I'm surprised that, he's a guy who's always wanted to be at the front. So I think that might also be a little bit of a sign that he's maybe not that close to the new leadership here. The former presidential candidate, of course, Ricardo Anaya, who was only back in Mexico because now he has immunity. But anyway, there he is as well. Just kind of, I don't recognize some of these other faces, but the whole thing just doesn't sit well with anybody. I think even their own supporters. Did they delete it yet?
As far as I know, it's still there.
Oh, my goodness. All right. Well, now, before we're going to move on to the good news from Mexico here, and we've actually had a lot of good news, the whole first couple of segments there, I think we're good news. We wanted to focus on something in particular here, which I think you made a great analogy, calling it the ERA for Mexico. What do you mean by that?
So we've seen and we've talked in this program about the raft of constitutional amendments that Morena is passing because of its qualified majority, its 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. Up till now, these had all been constitutional amendments that were proposed as part of the package of 20 amendments proposed by López Obrador back in February, which set the stage for the campaign. Right? The campaign was, give us the qualified majority so that we can give you these amendments, including the judicial reform. And the public said, all right, here's your qualified majority. So they've been passing those. This amendment is the first really shine bomb amendment. This wasn't in the package of 20 by López Obrador. And yes, it's very much Mexico's equal rights amendment, right? For those of us who, history lesson, para los jóvenes, como as AMLO would say, the United States back in the 70s made a big effort to pass what was called the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have brought gender equity to the constitutional level in the United States. And there was a big push to do that, and it passed Congress. And then there was a big push by this newly invigorated new right at the time, that new right which then took shape in Reaganism, to kill that amendment. And they killed it by making sure that enough legislators didn't ratify it. So it got killed at the legislative level. There's been efforts to try to revive it in the U.S. recently, but the statute of limitations has run out on that. They put a kill clause in there. They put a poison pill in there saying, if it gets past this date and it's not ratified, then it's over. So that died in the U.S. And it's gratifying to see that in Mexico, it's now part of the Constitution. So this ERA what it does is reforms a few different articles of the Constitution, as well as a few what's called leyes secundarias, or secondary laws that emanate from the Constitution. And what it provides for is very basically that equality is now embedded into the Mexican Constitution. What does that mean in practical terms? That means equal pay for equal work. That Congress has to make that push to close that gap, the salary gap, which of course exists. They have to push constitutionally mandated to close the salary gap. All laws coming out of Congress have to have a gender perspective in them. Gender parity in federal, state, and municipal cabinets. And also it provides for us the establishment of what are called fiscalías especializadas, or women's rights attorney general's offices. Within the attorney general's office, is to set up a women's rights office to deal specifically with women's issues, right? To specifically push at the legal standpoint on women's issues. So like a specialized branch of the attorney general's offices to do that. So the important thing here is that it not just remain an abstract clause in the Constitution, but that it actually leads directly to, pay equality, gender perspective, and legislative action in cases of feminicides and other things. We've talked very recently about this kind of medieval attorney general of the state of Querétaro, which tried to go after a young indigenous minor who had apparently been raped by a family member, and try to go after her instead of, giving her the support that she needed. And actually, Mexico's new women's cabinet post, women's secretariat, the leader there, Citlali Hernandez, of that new cabinet post, stepped in, went to Querétaro, and shut that down. She shut that down and brought that attorney general to heel. And they actually appeared together at a joint press conference where he said, we're renouncing this witch hunt against this girl. So that was good. But the constitutional amendment now will bring that perspective into everything in the Constitution. So that's a welcome development.
Absolutely. And one thing I always like to highlight, right? Like, there was some criticism from NGO groups, liberal feminist organizations, that Claudia wouldn't represent a change despite being the first woman president. You have it right here. Here's proof that they were wrong. Here's proof that having a woman president makes a difference, that she champions these causes, right? I think it's really quite interesting in this video that we're seeing from her Twitter page, where she comes out, first thing she says, hey, today we're going to talk about women, right? We're going to talk about women in the Constitution. So, signing this decree, officially making now that constitutional amendment to include everything that you just described to us, right? Of actually putting it front and center. And again, I want to emphasize that, right? Of creating a cabinet level post to address women's issues, of it actually being concrete and intervening positively in the lives of women. It's incredible. It's incredible. This is what the country really needed. This is why it matters that somebody like Claudia, not just a woman, right? Because remember, in the last election, Xochitl Gálvez could have been the winner. Would she be doing these kinds of things? Would she be the champion of working class women the way that she is, focusing on things like the salary gap, right? Making sure that there is a gender perspective. Anyway, I also saw some very funny memes, speaking of Xochitl Gálvez, where they superimposed her gaffes onto scenes from the G20, when she dropped her luggage and all. Anyway, it would have been embarrassing. Instead, we'd be talking about the embarrassing show that Mexico just put on at the G20. But instead, we get to talk about the way that we have throughout this program here about the impact of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico and at the global stage. All right. So our final segment for today, as always, can't miss it, losers and haters. And this week, we're talking about this piece from the Associated Press, but I chose this one in particular from Fortune because check out this headline. It's actually slightly different from the one the AP put out. A credit downgrade, a judiciary overhaul, and a furious president. Mexico's economic storm explained. It's a storm. Once again, these words, I think words you would never see if it was a different country, if it was about Canada or the United States. It's a storm, economic storm. And of course, the article is largely focused on this. Mexico's president lashed out Friday at Monday's rating service after it downgraded the Mexican government's debt outlook to negative. So it went from stable to negative because of the newly approved laws in Mexico could weaken the judiciary branch and checks and balances. It'll reaffirm Mexico's Baa2 overall credit, which again, the credit rating actually didn't go down. It was the debt outlook, but said increased government debt represented a risk for Mexico. Now, you shared with me a very interesting article from the 2 governments ago under Peña Nieto, the pre-Peña Nieto. And what did they have to say then? Moody's, the same ratings firm, gave its support.
They loved it.
Peña Nieto's reforms.
Yes,
Disastrous reforms. That they loved. So what can we say? So we get these headlines, we see these articles being put out every time these ratings agencies decide that they want to have something to say when it comes to domestic economic policy in a country like Mexico. But we know that when it comes to neoliberal reforms, they're all in favor. All of a sudden, what does this actually tell us? What should we make of this Moody's so-called downgrade?
Well, the very clear point here is that these ratings agencies are political bodies. They're not objective ratings agencies. And they act in a very political manner. So what you saw with these disastrous reforms of Peña Nieto in 2013 and 2014, which led to greatly increased Mexican indebtedness. The debt increased much more under Peña Nieto than it did under López Obrador. Much more. Check the numbers. Moody's love that. But when you have a government like, the 4T, which has a whole totally new economic model, right? Oh, they play politics with it and say, of course, they're hedging their bets, right? Because they didn't actually downgrade. They just said, oh, the outlook isn't good because of the judicial reform and this and that. Come on. Let us not forget that these were the same ratings agencies that gave AAA ratings to the toxic mortgage bonds in the U.S. before the crash of 2008. Same ones. Haven't learned a lesson, haven't learned a damn thing from that. At least Ann Seltzer in the U.S., which made that disastrous Iowa poll, which said that Kamala Harris was going to win Iowa, is retiring from polling. Right?
Oh, really?
But these people who gave AAA ratings to toxic bonds before the 2008 crash continue just the same, right? And they were talking up Peña Nieto, which was a disaster. And they were talking down López Obrador since 2019, predicting disasters that never happened. And here they are doing it again. And when I mean to say that these are political agencies, it's because they full well know that if they, these private agencies, that if they downgrade Mexico's ratings, that leads to higher interest rates that Mexico has to pay. That's what it does. Yeah. That's their way of trying to screw over progressive government by increasing their interest rates, by increasing their borrowing costs. That's why I say these are political mechanisms. And, I love this headline. Go back to the headline, right? Because it's just, these ridiculous, sensationalist, silly headlines, right? A furious president and, a credit downgrade, which didn't happen. Mexico's economic storm. What is this economic storm supposed to mean? Remember, Jose Luis, when I pointed out the New York Times in 2022, when then bureau chief down here, Maria Abi Habib, just flippantly said that Mexico's economy was cratering in a year in which the economy grew 3%. I called her out. And then she responded by saying, well, it might crater in the future. What utter BS. From the New York Times, saying that Mexico's economy was cratering. And now they're saying Mexico's economic storm. You see how this works? They try to create the very storm that they want to happen by these headlines, by this blatantly lying and reporting, and then by saying, oh, the outlook isn't good because of the judicial overhaul and this and that, and the deficits and the spending. They're trying to create something ahead of the fact. And that's what I mean by saying that they're political bodies.
I can't help but pronounce New York Times the way that López Obrador did when he was making fun of them. New York Times. Imagínate. Oh, New York Times. Yeah. It's true. What is it? What's the old gray lady? That's what they call her?
Yeah.
Come on. I wanted to scroll down here a little bit just to where it talks about, because it doesn't really even hold up on their own logic, right? Yeah. You mentioned the possibility the government will have to transfer more money to shore up the highly indebted state oil company Pemex. First of all, actually, Pemex's debt has actually dropped. The thing they said that was impossible, that the government wasn't ever going to be able to, it's actually decreasing. And I will remind you Again, Moody's, which backed Peña Nieto's reforms, it was during Peña Nieto that the oil company shot up in its debt because they treated it as a cash cow.
That's right.
In order to not pad the national debt. Calderon did likewise. But I also wanted to highlight Claudio's comments, which I think are correct, right? And from an objective point of view, President Claudia Sheinbaum said that the ratings agencies often have a bias of origin against the economic policies her party adopted under former President López Obrador, who took office on December 1st, 2018. Quote, many times these rating agencies are aimed at issuing evaluations starting from an economic model, Sheinbaum said. Starting in 2018, the economic model in our country changed. Many times these ratings have this bias of origin. She's absolutely right. They're using the old ways. And you know what the proof is? Not the same agency, but Fitch. You know what Fitch had to say recently? Oh, it raised its evaluation of Argentina. Where people are digging through the garbage to eat.
Look at that.
That's what they want. You want the approval of Moody's, you want the approval of Fitch? Go and do the far-right economic program, the murderous, deadly program that Milei is carrying out. But you know what? If Mexico's economic model invites hate from these people, I think we're on the right path.
I welcome their hatred, right? The old FDR line. And watch out, U.S. Watch out, U.S., because the new Department of Governmental Efficiency that's going to be run by Elon Musk in the United States is openly looking at the Milei model. And is openly wanting to import the Milei model to the U.S. So there you are. That DOGE there, that Department of Government Efficiency, is basically going to be Milei imported to the United States. So there you are there. And the point about Pemex is well taken. Pemex is extraordinarily profitable, Jose Luis. It's extraordinarily profitable. The problem is it's been taxed at about a 70% tax rate in previous governments. They leached Pemex dry to cover up for, corruption and insufficient tax receipts. Pemex itself, if you take away its extremely high tax rate, the tax is extraordinarily profitable. It's an extraordinarily profitable company. But they don't want you to know that.
Well, it destroys their whole narrative.
Yeah.
That's just it. All right, Kurt. We reached the end of another program here on Soberania. Really fun having this conversation this time. I was looking forward to this episode. I even had a tweet that said, we're going to be talking about Claudia at the G20 this week, and I got a lot of love, so I'm happy that we were able to cover this. I was always really grateful for everybody who's tuned in, watching, viewing, sharing, liking, subscribing, joining. Thank you so much, especially those who have joined to the St. Patrick's Battalion. We really appreciate the support. Kurt, any last words?
Just that. Thanks for all your support and all your retweets and all your comments in the videos. We're very pending to all of that. If you can join the St. Patrick Battalion, it's just the cost of a latte a month so that I can keep making more confetti, right? And who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to have a little joy in their lives? So my name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine Sentido Común. We'll see you next week on another episode of Soberania.